All right, in this video we're going to learn about the NWEA Learning Continuum report. Some details of the Learning Continuum report. It does organize material by 10-point RIT bands, so we can explore assessment content within those bands that span the various scores of the test. You can find content for specific grades. We can narrow it down. Learning statements. We can review statements that show how the material your students may encounter on the MAP growth assessment aligned to the RIT scale. And there are grouping options to organize learning statements around academic standards or NWEA defined learning topics. Please remember that the RIT score is the area where the student is answering test items correct and incorrect around 50% of the time. The RIT score is the zone where the students, it's kind of their optimal learning. So items that they've mastered, 50%, and then items that they're ready to learn with some scaffolding and some support, about 50%. The reason this occurs, why we do this test is designed to target 50% correct, is the students get a personalized experience that matches their skill level, and the test identifies how students perform regardless of grade level. If the tests were made to be too easy, the students would get all of the answers correct, and the test wouldn't tell us how high a student can reach. We wouldn't get that ZPD, that zone of proximal development. And if the test is too hard, students would get all of the answers, test questions incorrect, and the test would not tell us anything about what the student knows. So we have this sweet spot that we kind of know what the student has mastered, and we know what they're ready to work on and how high their skill level goes. Here is an example of a math test item. So just a little bit of context. Each test item in the test bank is assigned an item difficulty rating. So this question has a difficulty rating of 185 for a RIT score. It gives a specific content standard, a specific learning statement, and is tied to an instructional area. This test item happens to be within the geometry instructional area. So that's kind of how it's broken down, by instructional area, by learning statement, and or content standard. Students may see a similar question like this. It may have a higher or lower difficulty rating depending on how well or poorly the student is doing on the test. So you may see learning statements in two different categories depending on the RIT level difficulty of the question. So this learning statement is determine the areas of triangles formulated. Wow, let me try that again. Determines the area of triangles, formula not provided. So you may see this learning statement more than one time on the learning continuum. It would just depend on the different difficulty rating of the question. So the learning continuum is organized in such a way that it lists out all of the learning statements that are assessed by test items in a specific item pool. So whether you're looking at math, you're looking at reading, you're looking at science. Each learning statement can be displayed in multiple locations, as I said, within the learning continuum, if that learning statement is associated with test items at different difficulty levels. And learning statements are grouped into instructional areas in the learning continuum. So just like we saw that test item for geometry, that's considered an instructional area. So how this report can help you as an educator. It helps educators understand what kind of content is being assessed at various difficulty levels. It enables educators to better understand the content of questions students are likely to get right and wrong about 50% of the time. And it saves educators time by acting as a starting place to inform formative strategies designed to identify skill gaps at the student, group, and class level. So you may be wondering, how does a student get their overall RIT score? So we have a fictitious student named Winston here, and on his math test, he got an overall RIT score of a 195. So again, this means that was the area he was getting items correct and incorrect about 50% of the time. So if we go down here to our RIT scale, the green boxes indicate a correct answer on a test item. Red boxes indicate an incorrect answer on a test item. So you can see here between the 160 and 170 range, he was answering all of those items correctly, even to the 175 RIT range. And over here on the other end, the 210, 220 RIT range, he was answering each item incorrectly, or most of the items incorrectly. So if his RIT range is a 195, he's going to be right in here. And you can see here that out of 6 items, he answered half of them correctly, half of them incorrectly, so about that 50% correct and incorrect, which would put him at that 195 for a RIT score. So being as the learning continuum falls within 10-point RIT bands, getting a 195, Winston is going to fall in that RIT band of 191 to 200, along with other students that you're looking at in the class. If you see a RIT band, like here we have 221 to 230, it's empty. That just means that no students scored within that 10-point RIT band. So again, at a 195, he's at the 191 to 200 10-point RIT band. And here, when we look at the report, you will see learning statements based on that RIT band of items that were answered correctly and incorrectly 50% of the time. We can also use the learning continuum to help with formative assessment in the classroom. So we've kind of looked at some of this already. Identify Winston or any student's overall RIT score. So we know he got a 195. We looked at that 10-point RIT band to match his overall RIT score. You can think about Winston and thousands of other students who perform similarly to Winston to give context to what the data is showing you in the continuum. We're looking at the learning statements in the RIT band that match the student, in this case Winston's overall RIT score, and recognize that Winston and similar students got those learning statements correct and incorrect around 50% of the time. We compare the learning statements with your current knowledge of the student and how they're progressing in your classroom or a group of students to look at what they've demonstrated, what they may already have mastered out of those learning statements. So you can start breaking down and taking out learning statements that you know the student or group of students have mastered. And then that remaining group of learning statements that you know they haven't mastered is kind of going to be their ZPD, their zone of proximal development. So that's the sweet spot where you know the student is ready to learn. They may need some support, they may need some scaffolding, but those are the statements that they're ready to work on and be able to learn. And we can also identify out of those learning statements their skill gaps for the various content items. You can also break down the learning continuum by learning statement. So in this case, we've looked at math. So the learning statements that fall within the math assessment are the categories of geometry, measurement and data, number and operations, operations and algebraic thinking. Even though the test gives an overall RIT score, so we know Winston got a 195 overall, it does break it down by these instructional areas to give a RIT score based on the instructional area. So if we're looking at geometry, we can see that he scored his lowest here at a 186. So geometry is definitely going to be an area of focus that Winston needs to work on. Winston got a 196 on measurement and data, and a 199 in both number and operations and algebraic thinking. So obviously these two learning statements are where he is the strongest, and then again geometry is where he is the weakest. So if we're looking at just the area of geometry at a 186, in the 10-point RIT band on the learning continuum, that would fall in the 181 to 190 categories. So we would scroll down until we see geometry. Right now it's showing operations and algebraic thinking. We could click on geometry and then it would give us all of the statements for geometry. But if we're looking at Winston, this area is going to be his ZPD, or that zone of proximal development, for the category of geometry. Overall, he's a 195, so the 10-point RIT band 191 to 200 is going to be where he falls overall if we're looking at the test as a whole. You can also break it apart based on those RIT scores and those learning statements. So the ZPD is the difference between what the student can do independently and what they can do with targeted assistance or scaffolding in the classroom. So again, this is a more close-up. So Winston's geometry RIT area would be in this 181 to 190 range. We'd click on geometry and it would give us those instructional area statements for geometry. Or we could look at the overall score, and that would fall under this category, and we could see statements for each of those learning statements. All right, so you're probably thinking, do I have to go in and get each student's RIT score? How can I do this in a meaningful way that kind of matches what the learning continuum used to be, where you could have lists of students that were incorporated into the report? They've updated. We can no longer see student names or groupings in the learning continuum, but there is a way to get a report that has your students grouped by RIT score, instructional area, or projected proficiency on the next testing term. So we're going to look to download this class breakdown by RIT, instructional area, or projected proficiency. So I'm going to go to the web and show you where that is located. So I've already logged into the NWEA.org site. We're focused on map growth, so I'm going to go up here to map growth and click. I'm going to scroll down to where it says other reports, and I'm going to click map growth reports. If we scroll down, this is the list of all the reports. We'll see there's the learning continuum. We're going to come back to that. We're looking for this class breakdown by RIT, instructional area, or projected proficiency. So I'm going to click on that. Your screen may look a little different than mine. If you're a teacher just in one building, it's probably going to default your school and the instructor name. I see all the schools, so I have to pick. So I'm just going to pick a school. I'm going to pick an instructor for the purpose of showing you. If you have multiple classes at a school, you could pick a different class if you teach multiple grade levels. And here's the part I want to focus on. It's going to default to class breakdown by RIT. So that's going to give you a breakdown of your students by their overall RIT score. Instructional area is going to give you their grouping based on their RIT score by each individual instructional area. So geometry, numbers and operation, and then you can select a test. So if you want to look at math or you want to look at reading or science, you could pick that. Or projected proficiency. That's going to give you a RIT score for what the student is projected to score on their next benchmark assessment, depending on if they keep with the same level of growth and achievement that they had in the current benchmark. I would say for the purposes of the learning continuum, we're going to focus on either the by RIT or by instructional area. And when you're ready, you can choose to view the report online or create a PDF that you could save or print. I'm going to go back into my PowerPoint and show you some reports that are already created because I have to black out the identifying information for the student. So there's where we just were on the website. And here is what the report would look like by breakdown by RIT. I've blacked out the students' names, but you will see next to each student, it will give their RIT score for each assessment. Right now we're looking at just reading and math. And at the top, it will give you those 10-point RIT ranges. So the 10-point RIT range is 141 to 150. This student scored at the high end at 150. This student 149. And it'll just keep going up by those 10-point RIT bands, giving you the actual RIT score for each student. So you can really use these instructional areas and these 10-point RIT bands to compare to the learning continuum when we get there. So 161 to 170 would compare with the learning continuum math report. You would see that same 161 to 170 with the learning statements underneath. So this is a great way to still be able to use the learning continuum how maybe you were used to using it. Just have an extra step involved to get that report. And the nice thing is if you print this report, you can kind of have it, and you could use these for maybe small group instruction in your classroom. You can see where to best group students. We can also do it by instructional area. Same report, same 10-point RIT bands, but instead of just listing like math or reading, it's going to give you each of those instructional areas for whatever test you're looking at. This happens to be math. So numbers and operation, again, it's going to give you that student name. It's going to give you their actual RIT score for that instructional area. Algebraic concepts, same thing. And it's going to have those 10-point RIT bands at the top. So if you wanted to group students in your classroom based on where they need instructional support for a category, you could do that as well. And again, we can match these to the Learning Continuum report. All right, I'm going to go in and show you the Learning Continuum. So I'm going to go back to home. Go to map growth. I'm going to go back to other reports, map growth reports. And I'm going to scroll down. So again, this was that class breakdown that we printed out or have on our screen to view. And then we're going to click on Learning Continuum. That's the report we're going to utilize with that instructional breakdown report. All right, so we have to pick a test. The sample document that I showed you was for a grade 1 math. So I'm going to pick math K-2. I can go up to grade and narrow it down more. So if I'm a first grade teacher, I'm going to make sure I want to click on first grade. Otherwise, it's going to give you learning statements for all of the pre-K to second grade, and that doesn't necessarily help us. So I'm going to narrow it to first grade. You will see that you can group it by standard. So I have content standards listed here. So CC 2.1.1.B.1, extend the counting sequence to read and write numbers to represent objects. You will see for this first grade test there are no statements, which means there are no questions associated with this standard. I can also group it by topic, which is going to break it down by topic of test question in NWEA. So if we're looking at this 121 to 130 RIT band, you can see that whole numbers, counting, and cardinality. We're looking to represent a given set of objects as a numeral within 10 and numeral within 5. I can scroll down and it's going to go through the different learning statements. So this one was numbers and operations, counting and cardinality. Numbers and operations, base 10 and fractions. Algebraic concepts. I can also scroll left and right if I'm looking for additional 10-point RIT bands. So if I'm looking for a student who got a 160, I'm going to scroll over until I get to the RIT band 151 to 160. I can click on if I just want to look at geometry. If I click this, it's automatically going to scroll down to where geometry starts. I could do the same, look at algebraic concepts. So it's up to you on what type of area you want to focus your search on. If I don't feel like scrolling over, I can also use these quick links up at the top. So if I want to do a 230, I can click that and it's automatically going to go over to where there's the 230 in the writ band. So again, if we're looking at the writ band 141 to 150, and I'm looking at represent and solve problems, whole numbers, addition, subtraction, these are going to be the learning statements where the student got the answer is 50% correct and 50% incorrect. So again, you'll want to go through and kind of take out the things you know they've mastered, and then you can focus more on the things that they need to focus on. If I highlight these, I can copy and paste them. So if you wanted to create your own Word document or some type of additional document where you can start deleting these areas that you know that the student has mastered, that's fine. Again, I could go back to grouping by standard. If that's more beneficial to you, it just depends on what you'd rather focus on. Would you rather focus on the content standard that you're teaching, or would you rather focus on the topic as it's associated with the test and the questions in NWEA? So I hope this video has helped you kind of understand the learning continuum a little more and how it can be used to group your students and kind of used as a formative assessment tool as well in your classroom.